So I was counting that we have people in the audience here today visiting from over 20 institutions and at least 4 countries. And so I thought I would take 1 minute in my introduction to just, again, welcome everybody here to Northwestern. So here you're looking at the beautiful green park-like setting and lake, but you're looking at some more things that are directly related to our conversations today and to the speaker whom I'm about to introduce. We look out over Chicago. Chicago was a city built on innovation. It was the first major city of the industrial age. And we're here in Evanston, the very first suburb in the United States. We also look out over, of course, Northwestern University, where scholars from across the university are working to improve education. Of course, in the school I direct, the School of Education and Social Policy, we have many, many scholars doing that. But one thing that's really amazing about this university is we're here in the Kellogg School of Management, and you have education scholars in the School of Kellogg, in the business school. In McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, right over there. Throughout the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences in economics, statistics, political science, sociology, and anthropology. In the Beanan School of Music and in the School of Communication, which are in that other beautiful building just down the lake. And then in our Streeterville campus in downtown Chicago as well, in both the Feinberg School of Medicine as well as the Pritzker School of Law. I think that a university is at its best when you have experts from all sorts of different domains, all interested in solving the most challenging questions in the world, including improving education. This spirit of innovation that we have here at Northwestern, of finding expertise from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds to make a difference in education, one individual or one classroom, one organization at a time, of course, is exemplified by our speaker, Wendy Kopp. I'm extremely honored to welcome back to Northwestern Wendy Kopp, who is the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, a global network that develops collective leadership in classrooms and communities around the world. Wendy founded Teach for America in 1989 to marshal the energy of her generation against educational inequity in the United States. Today, close to 7,000 Teach for America core members, outstanding recent college graduates and professionals of all academic disciplines, just like what we're describing at Northwestern, are in the midst of 2-year teaching commitments in 53 urban and rural regions. And Teach for America has proven to be an unparalleled source of long-term leadership for expanding opportunity for children. We're proud to say that since Teach for America's founding, more than 800 Northwestern alumni, including a significant percentage of School of Education and Social Policy graduates, have joined this organization. In fact, last year, Northwestern was a top contributor amongst the medium-sized schools, 15 students joining the 2018 core just last year. Wendy, who led Teach for America's growth and development for 24 years, transitioned out of the role of CEO in 2013. Today, she remains an active member for Teach for America's board, a thought leader, and a tireless globetrotter. In a recent op-ed for the Financial Times, Wendy made the case for treating education as a global issue. The solutions, she said, are shareable across borders, and we need to invest in enabling local leaders to learn from one another in education, just as we do in health and in other sectors. Very much in the spirit of the conversation we've been having today. Currently, the Teach for All network is comprised of partner organizations in 50 countries on 6 continents, including its newest edition, Teach for Morocco. Wendy has been recognized as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people and has received numerous honorary degrees and awards for public service. Last month, she shared the lessons she's learned from Teach for America and Teach for All as she delivered the commencement address at University of California at Berkeley. It's a privilege and an honor to introduce Wendy Kopp, who, like the Yidan Prize, is on a mission to create a better world through education. Wendy.
Well, thank you so much, David. It is a real honor to be here at Northwestern, which, as you just heard, is really one of the biggest contributors of incredible young leaders to Teach for America over the years, with 800 people, as you just heard, who've come from this institution and channeled their energy into teaching in our urban and rural public schools. I just met the incoming 25 of them who are coming in from this year's graduating class, and want to welcome those of you who found your way to the business school to this talk. I'm also really honored to be asked to be part of this Yidan Summit. I think one thing I've seen in this global journey over the last decade is that very few people think about education as a global issue. There's a huge constituency for improving local education and improving education at the national level, but very few people who realize how much more quickly we could all be moving if we thought about it as a global issue where we could be sharing solutions and where our fates are really interconnected. And I think Mr. Yidan is a real pioneer in taking a global approach. So it's just a real honor to be here as a part of this. And then finally, I'm excited to be, I guess, the bridge between a focus on research to a focus on development, which I think is tomorrow's focus. I think one of the conundrums we face in education is that often initiatives that research shows are effective in one context don't prove to be effective when they're scaled across multiple contexts, and we've heard a little bit about that through the course of this day. And I think the lessons we've learned over the 30 years of the Teach for America and Teach for All journeys provide some insight into how to scale progress. So I'm really excited to share more about my journey in this. So this all started, as you've heard, 30 years ago when I was a senior in college at Princeton. Our generation was known as the me generation. Supposedly, we just all wanted to go work on Wall Street. But I was a graduating senior public policy major at again, a liberal arts college. And I was just searching for something I wasn't finding in terms of a way to make a real difference in the world. And I was sure I wasn't alone, that there were thousands of other graduating seniors out there searching for a way to make a difference, and particularly to make a difference against the kind of inequities in our country. And what I saw was that all the recruiters were investment banks and management consulting firms, this is 1989, banging down our doors and asking us to commit just 2 years to work in their firms. So the big idea was, what if we were recruited as aggressively to commit just 2 years to teach in our urban and rural schools? And the minute I thought of it, I became really obsessed. Not only, both because of the talent and energy that these folks could channel into schools and the impact they could have on kids, but also thinking, like, how different would our country be if our most promising future leaders, first 2 years out of college, were teaching in low-income communities instead of working in banks? I was convinced that was going to change everything. It's taken a lot longer than I thought it would to just shift our priorities as a country and change our consciousness. So that was the big idea. I'm so grateful for Princeton's thesis requirement. So I did, in fact, do all this research, and as I did more and more research, I became more and more convinced it just had to happen, but thank heaven for the discipline of having to do that research and ultimately develop a plan and argument for the creation of this. This was very quickly far beyond me, and to make a very long story short, over the last now 30 years, 60,000 people, outstanding recent college graduates, a very diverse group of them from all over the country, have channeled their energy into initially making 2-year commitments to teach in 53 urban and rural regions across the country. And very notably, they never left. 84%, so 7,000 are in teaching right now in the 2-year commitment, and 53,000 have finished their 2 years. But 84% of them are still in the work. 2/3 of them, almost 64%, in education, and another 20% in policy, legal services, public health, but in and around improving the quality of life in low-income communities, or the quality of schools and education. So I think one sometimes misconception about Teach for America is that it is about 2 years of teaching. It is about 2 years of teaching, which are crucial, and it's about every year after the 2 years. I had my head down and was fully focused on the US and on addressing the massive continuing challenges here, trying to make Teach for America bigger and better, and really hadn't thought about the rest of the world. It never occurred to me, which is kind of embarrassing to admit, that this idea might have applicability in other countries. What happened was that about 14 years ago, there was something in the water in the rest of the world, and within 1 year, I had met 13 people from India to Lebanon to China to Chile to many other places who were just determined that something similar to Teach for America needed to happen in their countries. And so that's what led to the launch of Teach for All, which is a network of independent, locally led organizations in now 50 countries, as you heard, and growing in every part of the world. There are another 25 in the pipeline, including 10 in Africa, so we're soon going to balance out the map just a bit. So the issue that all of us across the Teach for All network are addressing is the fact that the circumstances of kids' birth predict their educational and life outcomes. We, across this network, understand this problem to be very complex, deeply systemic, meaning it does not start in classrooms. And I thought I would use this picture of these two incredible little boys who I met recently in Ogun State, Nigeria. We were walking around a school with the Teach for Nigeria teachers, and they said, we have to introduce you to these two kids who have brought light to the school. I mean, they literally figured out, these two boys, how to, like, if you go into the rooms, there are these hanging ropes with lights, and they're the people who fix all the teachers' solar lamps versus the technician in the town. They're like, these kids are better. They're better than the folks in the town. So we meet these boys, and it was my kid's summer vacation, so I had my own 14-year-old with me, and he asked them, I think he was really relating to them because he's kind of an industrious kid too. He's like, how old are you guys? And they said they were 14. And I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but my son isn't a big kid, but they were half his size. They don't always get a meal a day. And the challenges in that they're, you see in their example, like exactly what we're here to address. Like they have incredible potential, right? I mean, these kids are incredible, but they're facing so many challenges before they show up in school. And then they're going to a school that in no way has the resources to meet their extra needs and move them ahead. And the problem is fueled by a prevailing ideology rooted in very low expectations for what kids born in these circumstances can do. So that is the problem we're addressing. And our belief is that in the face of such a complex problem, we need to change the system. Meaning, for those kids, as they need as many teachers as they can have for as long as they can teach, who are willing to go to heroic extents to make up for everything that's wrong, to make up for the limitations of the system. And so that's really, really important. But we need to change the system. And how do you change a system? And this whole effort is built on the idea that people change systems, that leadership changes systems, and that we need to make a really intentional effort to cultivate the leadership capacity within local communities to actually solve this problem so that future generations of kids don't have to rely on heroic teachers. So this is the ultimate idea, that these organizations are working to create leaders who will work at every level of the system, at the classroom level, and the school leader level, and the school system level, and the ministries, and also outside the system to fix the nutrition systems and health systems and early literacy systems, and also that they will, through their efforts, support and catalyze and partner with many other leaders in their communities, students and students' parents and other teachers in schools and others in their communities. 3 years ago, we stepped back as a network and considered the question, by 25 years from now, what is the big vision? What are we working to accomplish together? And one of the things we did, so by that point we were in 40 countries. We'd gone from 2 to 40 countries in 8 years, and we realized we really need to come together and rethink our foundational kind of strategic framework. And so we considered this question, and one thing we did was talk to a bunch of people about where the world would be in 25 years. And of course, everyone in this room, we think about this stuff all the time, right? Like how much the economy is changing, how much the planet is falling apart. And I think the biggest thing that happened to us in this vision setting process was, I think it just brought into stark relief that if our kids in our classrooms today are not growing as leaders who can shape a better future for themselves, like get on a path to meaningful careers in spite of a changing economy, and for all of us, shape a better future for all of us by gaining the sense of agency and awareness and the skills and collaboration skills and values and such to actually solve increasingly complex problems that face communities and that face our global society, that there's no hope for any of us. And so this process led us to articulate a vision whereby by 25 years from now, we would see whole communities in every part of the world enabling all their kids to have the education and support and opportunity to shape a better future for themselves and all of us. So to get on a path to this vision, each of these network organizations are working to galvanize the rising generation of most promising future leaders in their countries to channel their energy into this arena of working with the most marginalized kids. And I'll just use this example. Charles Abore was one of the first cohort members for Teach for Uganda, which is one of our newest partners. He grew up in a refugee camp his entire life, convinced someone to let him go to school. He was the 10th kid in his family and actually was given a name that meant that he wasn't supposed to go to school. It's an amazing story. He overcomes every odd and goes to a 40,000 student STEM university in Uganda, becomes the student body president, and as of a year and a half ago had offers from everyone, PwC, MTN, the big cell phone company, and he decides he's going to join Teach for Uganda. I'm still amazed when I think about his opportunity costs. But so now he is a year and a half in teaching in this very remote rural village, which does not have, he can't connect, which is his biggest issue with it. But in the year and a half since he's been there working with another Teach for Uganda teacher and the others in the community, one thing he realized is there were more kids outside of school than in school. There were 90 kids coming to school. Now 200 kids come to school every day. Like they did all these community walks and they basically inspired the confidence of the families in sending their kids to school. And now Charles is trying to figure out literally, should I run for parliament? He has incredible political potential. Or should I start a comprehensive community-based organization to meet the comprehensive needs of the kids in this community? And I share that example because it says so much about what we're working to do. You know, Ugandans will solve Uganda's problems. There is no other path. And we need not just one and not just a few, but many of Uganda's most promising future leaders to channel their energy into this arena if we're going to get on a path just addressing challenges as extreme as those in Uganda, where fewer than 20% of fourth graders can read a paragraph in their own language, for example. I mean, the infrastructure is so weak, so we need to build the local leadership capacity. What we've seen is that when many Charleses channel their energy into communities, it really does add up to make a difference. And I'll just share a couple of examples. Teach for India was one of the first launches within the Teach for All network, and they've placed 500 teachers over time in a community known as Pune. And this is actually a slide from a deck they recently walked me through. So it says, we will make Pune a national proof point of what is possible and collectively build and amplify a reimagined education for all of Pune's children. But the story behind this slide is that 8 years ago, I was in Pune in the backyard of someone who was hosting a fundraiser for Teach for India, and a guy got up and said, hi. He introduces himself and says, I just finished my 2-year commitment to Teach for India, and I've just been put in charge of this region. And I just got back from New Orleans, where Teach for All did a network learning trip where many of the kind of leaders among the alumni of these different countries went to see what was happening in New Orleans. And he said, what we saw in New Orleans was it's possible to build a citywide movement to change things for kids. And that's what we're going to do in Pune. And I remember this moment so vividly because I realized no one at the fundraiser thought it was crazy. I mean, this seemed totally unrealistic. There was no movement. And what's so fascinating is this slide deck talks through, here's what we've done in the last 8 years. And you know, individuals working together among the alumni of Teach for India did a whole bunch of things. One thing they did was convince the government, the local government, to give them 10 school buildings so that they could start 10 English medium high schools. The English medium system stopped in 7th grade. And so there was nowhere for the kids to go, and so they just dropped out of school. But they started 10 reimagined schools. And those schools are getting incredible results for kids. Another group started a collective action organization that brought the business community and the governmental leaders and the NGOs together to develop a coherent strategic plan for improving the system. Another group started something called LIFT that each year retrains 1,500 government teachers on a government contract. Another group started something called the India School Leadership Initiative that's recruiting and developing a generation of school principals. And this deck lays out, here's our plan for the future, 100 reimagined schools. We're launching the Pune Children's Zone to connect early education and school-to-work services to each of these schools, et cetera. So I share that example just to make really tangible what we mean by system change and by the idea that we're cultivating leaders who will actually work to change the system. And the thing that's just so fascinating is it's like the same movie playing in such diverse cultural contexts. So another of the organizations that started 10 years ago was Enseña Chile. It was the first of the Latin American partners. And this is just an image from their 10th anniversary. It's actually an image of a percussion kind of drum band showing the collective construction of music as an analogy to, you know, building the collective leadership necessary for change in education. But they've brought in 500 people into and have produced 500 alumni over the last 10 years. 78% of them still working full-time in education. 30 of them are working in the ministry, including the right hand in charge of policy to the education minister. Others have started a network of schools that are showing they were inspired by the KIPP schools we heard earlier about, and other kind of transformational schools in low-income communities, really showing people that something entirely different is possible for kids. Another group of them started something called Impulso Docente, which is working to change the way other teachers are recruited, selected, trained, and supported. So all to say, these organizations are all working to kind of galvanize the leadership necessary to ultimately move the needle for kids in a significant way. So I think we've learned maybe 3 things over time that are fueling our optimism about the future and about the notion that we could really radically accelerate progress in education. The first of them is that there's something about this approach of finding people with leadership potential, building a culture among them, building their skills through deep professional development and coaching, immersing them in the highest need communities and supporting them to be successful with kids, that is foundational for the kind of leadership we need. You know, there's research on this, and I will say, even this past week, I spent some time with Cecilia Moe, who's a professor of political science at Berkeley, who's done a number of studies, not only about these organizations, but I mean, she's spent her life trying to find interventions that build civic engagement, that increase empathy, and that reduce bias, because her view is those things are the biggest issues. If we could get folks to overcome their bias, then we would act on evidence. And she said that I mean, she's been in this field for some time, and it's actually very hard to find interventions that impact those things. And what she was articulating to me was that they've found these organizations, they've done 5 studies across 5 countries, and they've found really significant impacts on those dimensions. So first of all, as we've discussed, I mean, these organizations really do change the career trajectories of the folks who sign up for them, and you can see in the bottom bullet point that the study on Teach for India showed that these folks were 50% more likely to work with low-income communities than the people who were right on the admissions line, who looked just the same but didn't do Teach for India. We also see, going back up to the top, really significant impacts on people's sense of possibility around the potential of their kids and the potential of their families. She explained to me that the difference in people who choose to do Teach for America versus those who don't in skin color bias is greater than the difference in the general population between white and Hispanic folks, which is a really significant impact. And you can see in the Enseña Chile study that folks go from thinking that the challenges are technical, like things like we need more funding, we need to reduce class size, to an understanding of how adaptive the nature of the change that we need is. So what the research shows is what I hear when I go around the world, and I have such a privilege to be able to meet with groups of these alumni everywhere from, you know, Dallas to Dhaka, Bangladesh, to the next place, to Denmark. I mean, literally those 3 places I've had meetings with the alumni of these organizations, and I always ask one question, which is what was the most striking thing you learned during your 2 years? And what's so fascinating is that no matter where I am, their answers fall into 2 buckets. One is, I gained such a sense of possibility in the potential of my kids and the solvability of the problem. And the other is, I learned so much about the complexity and the magnitude of the challenge. And when you think about the kind of leaders we need people who are rooted in the full complexity of the issues, who are under no illusion that one silver bullet is going to solve something this complex. I mean, we're not going to give kids a laptop and solve this problem, which some people still think we might be able to do. And at the same time, they do gain the kind of sense of possibility that we need in leaders who will go out and affect the kind of transformational change we need. The second thing we've seen is that leadership seems to be the core of the solution. And before I share what I view as evidence of this, I will say we had a really wonderful lunch today with a number of the incredible people here at Northwestern who do research and build evidence about the need for more research on what actually drives system change. So what I'm going to share is observations that I think add up to enough patterns that they should lead us to do some rigorous research. So let's start with Chicago. I'm not going to tell you all the stories of these communities, but the headline is, what I've seen over 20 to 30 years of placing folks in communities in this country is the needle moving for kids in an aggregate sense in a really significant way. So I could have put even more on this map, but in these places for sure I can tell you graduation rates have grown 20 to 30, in some cases slightly more percentage points in the last, say, 10 to 20 to 30 years. Proficiency levels have grown using the best tests we have, NAEP, like the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the state proficiency exams. Enrollment levels in many cases have increased. And there are also places where we have channeled a steady stream of incredible Teach for America folks over time who have not left, so they're just teeming with folks. And in almost all of these places, they're running between, let's say, 20 and 30% of the schools as school principals. They're all over the districts in district leadership roles. They're running many of the NGOs, and hundreds of them are teaching. So it's seeing that pattern, like, interesting, because there are many communities in this country where the needle has not moved for kids in an aggregate sense in the last 20 or 30 years. That's why we have the aggregate results that we have. And people say, well, we aren't really. I mean, we are moving the needle for kids. It's just not in the significant way that's happening in many of these in these communities. So I'll just share one concrete example, since we're right here next to Chicago, next to the Chicago Public Schools, which, I mean, I assume that this crew knows that Chicago Public Schools are considered to be one of the fastest improving urban districts in the country. I think most people not in Chicago would not realize that. Like, we read the headlines and we just assume nothing good is happening with kids in Chicago, but it's really not true. So first of all, to go back, when I was in college, Secretary Bennett, maybe some of you remember this, declared Chicago to be the worst urban system in America. And really, it was so stagnant, like things were not changing for kids. And I still remember reading Arne Duncan's letter when he left the superintendency. He wrote a letter, this was maybe 10 years ago, I guess, saying still only 6% of Chicago Public Schools kids are projected to get a college degree within 6 years. And I remember reading it because I was so annoyed that despite all that had been poured in, still, we were not moving the needle for kids. So it's interesting to now realize that that number is now 19%. So in the last 10 years, we've gone from, for many, many years, not moving the needle for kids to, okay, 19% of Chicago Public School kids are now projected to get a college degree within 6 years. Between the years of 4th and 8th grade, which is 5 years, kids in Chicago Public Schools make 6 years of progress. Most low-income kids don't make a year's progress in a year's time, which is why we have the disparity in outcomes that we have. So this is really significant progress in the third largest school system in the country. And there are many, many things that have gone into this. Let me be clear. I mean, far beyond Teach for America. I mean, many. This is an evidence of just, a tremendous level of community energy to change things for kids. It's also true that if you took all the Teach for America people out, you would take away a lot of that energy. 1,000 teachers who move their kids forward a year and a half worth of progress in a year's time. That's what the data shows. 260 school leaders, including 80 school principals. There are school leaders in 1 out of every 6 buildings. And the schools they're running are outperforming the other schools. They're running many of the significant change efforts outside of schools. The Chicago Public Education Fund, which has made a huge difference in bringing the philanthropists and the governmental folks together in a real partnership to take a disciplined approach to moving things forward for kids. Social entrepreneurs like Jeff Nelson, who started One Goal, which is working only with kids in the traditional Chicago public schools, high schools, who are between the 25th and the 75th percentile, matching them to colleges and getting 80+% college retention. I mean, this is, on a significant scale. I'm only beginning to describe the impact that they've had. So again, I think it's such an interesting question. Like, we must ask ourselves not only what interventions work, but how are systems changing? We have so many systems that are changing. Why is that? And I'm going to put my money on people in leadership being at the center of the change. And then the third lesson that we've learned really in the last decade as part of this global journey, which really fuels my optimism, is how much more quickly local leaders can move when they're exposed to what's working and what's possible in other places. So, I think most people, and I include myself in this bucket as of 12 years ago, think of education as very local. In fact, this is probably the biggest learning, right? Like, from our journeys, that without deeply locally rooted leaders who have deep trusting relationships and deep understanding of local community context and culture, there's no path to sustainable transformational change in education. I mean, this is a huge lesson of the reform movement in the US. And so when we started out supporting these social entrepreneurs from around the world to say, okay, we're going to build Teach for China, we're going to build Teach for India, the whole idea was, okay, they're going to take an intentional effort to cultivate locally rooted leaders who can change their systems. But when we got into this, we started realizing that the roots of the issues we're addressing are so similar from place to place. So we've realized that the sort of circumstances facing the most disadvantaged kids in these countries looks far more similar to the circumstances facing other disadvantaged kids in other countries than to the more privileged kids in their own countries. We have one theory of the problem for our entire network, which was co-created by folks. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there aren't contextual differences, huge differences in context and culture. But what it does mean, we spent a fair amount of time being very depressed by this. I did, at least. I felt like, okay, so we're just fighting the forces of gravity everywhere. Really, even the politics are really similar. Everything seems so similar. It can get really overwhelming until we realize, wait, there's a silver lining. It means we could all be learning from each other. The solutions are shareable. What if we had the ability of local leaders to understand what was working in other places? And I think that relates so much to the previous conversation. How do we enable knowledge sharing among the local leaders and practitioners? So we are working as a network to kind of live into these lessons and take our impact to a much higher level over the next 25 years in pursuit of that vision that I articulated. We're focused on a few things. One of them is continuing to grow the numbers of extraordinary leaders in communities all over the world. We're projecting that by 10 years from now, we'll be in 80 countries, that will bring in another 100,000 incredible leaders across those countries, who will, with quality, who will be deeply rooted and prepared to exert the kind of collective leadership we need. We're working to support all of our network partners to orient towards a broad set of outcomes for kids so that they are growing as leaders who can shape a better future for themselves and all of us. We're learning so much about how to train and support teachers who work effectively towards a broad set of outcomes for kids so that they will also become the kind of leaders who will reshape our schools, redesign them, reshape our systems so that we are building kids with and growing kids with the capabilities necessary to improve our collective welfare. And we're doing a lot to increase learning and sharing across borders. We're doing that in a couple of ways, and I think it kind of relates to the previous discussion, so I'll share. One thing we've done is launch a global learning lab that is about engaging practitioners all over the world, our folks, but also others, in surfacing and spreading insights from the classrooms making the most progress towards a broad set of outcomes, and from communities that are moving the needle for kids. So just as one example, we have classroom learning loops that, every 6 weeks, hundreds of educators can sign on, and they can virtually, as a cohort, visit over a 6-week period 3 classrooms, transformational classrooms in different parts of the world, and then work together to understand what is different about these teachers. What are the outcomes they're working towards? What are their mindsets? What actions are they taking to inform our frameworks, and also so that they themselves are part of the learning process? And we're planning to do the same thing at the level of whole communities. We're also investing in building ultimately hundreds of networks among teachers, among these alumni who will be pursuing similar interest areas, so that they can be part of these cross-border networks that are sharing solutions and learning from each other. And finally, we are working together with many, many others in the global community to work to surface insights from this work and from our communities to influence the global discussion on a couple of big questions that I do think kind of, again, relate to the discussions we've had here. One of them is the question of, how do we put people and leadership at the center of development? We spend $13 billion a year in foreign aid for education. It doesn't get to local leaders. It funds very narrow interventions that international NGOs can run and then leave. It funds a lot of consultants to governments. And in our experience, that's not what changes systems. So how do we figure out how to get many more of those resources to fuel the local leadership capacity necessary to see real system change? And then the second big question we're focused on is, how do we increase investment, just per this earlier discussion, in a global knowledge sharing infrastructure, in the networks, the capacity building efforts, the global public goods necessary to enable local leaders to learn from each other, so that we can, we believe, radically accelerate progress in education. So I'll just close by saying, I'm so grateful that I somehow found my way to this work 30 years ago. I hope I have another 30 years, because it seems like by 30 years from now, we can really be moving the needle in a significant way for kids all around the world. And I just, just as a marker, my senior year in college, and maybe some of you will remember this, the hit movie, or one of them, was Stand and Deliver. It's just, I think this is so striking, because this movie made a hero of Jaime Escalante, who was a calculus teacher in East Los Angeles, who had coached his kids to pass the advanced placement calculus exam. And it was a true story. ETS did not believe the test results and made the kids retake the test. And of course, they passed again. Did we send researchers out there? Nope. We did not. We sent Hollywood. We're going to make a hero out of this man who is clearly just an outlier. So that's the marker to me. We didn't even think it was replicable. And what I've been able to see over the last 30 years, I mean, first of all, we started realizing, in fact, researchers did ultimately go find out what Jaime Escalante did. We started seeing the same patterns in our most exceptional teachers. We started realizing there are classrooms all over. Then there became this propagation of hundreds of schools across this country and other countries, showing not only can we do what he did at a classroom level, we can do it at a whole school level. Do you know that 15 years ago, I still remember this, the conversation in the hallways of Teach for America was, we now know it's possible at the level of whole schools, but we've never seen it happen in a community. So Chicago and the many others that I could have talked through here, we weren't seeing that at that time. Fascinating. Now we've seen, like, you can move the needle for kids at a whole community level. And so that's what gives me optimism that by 25 years from now, we can see whole communities everywhere, in every region of the world, showing what's possible and fueling a worldwide movement to enable all kids to have the education and support and opportunity to shape a better future for all of us. Thank you. Questions, thoughts? I mean, I'd love to have an open discussion. I know there are so many questions about this work of ours, so feel free to bring your biggest, most critical questions.
Well, I don't know if it's the biggest and most critical, but one of the experiences with persons entering professional careers early on, so for example, lawyers who take on pro bono work early on, or work in the legal services kinds of areas, that as they continue into the profession, including some who stay in those domains, but some who, let's say, work for large firms, it really has sort of changed and reshaped their understanding, so they are much more likely to do pro bono work. So my question about this leadership capacity that you've been building is, X decades later, as you yourself have experienced, where else do these leaders sit? Have you been following and watching where they may have levers of influence in other sectors that help support the reforms that you're trying to now do worldwide?
So what's interesting is when we first started, and I remember for my first book, I was interviewing a lot of the Teach for America alumni from the first decade, and I still remember what one of them said. He started saying, you know, when we started, we thought we would teach for 2 years, and then we would go to health, to economic development, to all these different things. And he's like, what happened to us is we got involved in schools and we realized how much had to be done and how much could be done from almost reconceptualizing what a school is. Like so many of the schools that are getting transformational results are lengthening their hours and becoming community centers essentially, and bringing in the health clinics, and you know they're almost reconceptualizing. But we do ask ourselves, like, do more people need to leave? Because it really is a systemic issue. And clearly, a number of them have gone into public health. A number of them have, you know, there's an incredible example in the UK of one of the alumni of Teach First who created something called Frontline, which now recruits 500 people a year to be social services workers and leaders. And I mean, they're now a huge percentage of the social service workforce in the UK. It's fascinating. And now, you know, they're doing a number of other things like that. So there is a lot, but there probably needs to be more.
In Teach for America, one of the key features of recruiting has been the initial 2-year commitment, right? That's been appealing to students coming out of college. I'll do this, like you said, and then they get more invested. In Teach for All, has it been the same thing, or have people come with, you know, the idea that this is going to be a longer commitment from the start?
It is the same thing, and it is a huge key to this. I mean, what you'll hear all around the world is in my country, and everyone thinks they're unique, there is so much pressure around kids getting on a path to their careers. So the 2-year commitment is such an enabler. Again, it really does not correlate to what happens in the end. Don't tell anyone that, but at least who's an undergrad. But that's the challenge, right? Because we too think this is a long game, and this is not, we're not going to solve this problem in 2 years. We need every year. But we can't tell people that. And of course, any undergrads, you're free to make your own choices, and we really do need enlightened business leaders who understand these issues and will, you know, help support the cause. So,
one really important part of education now is early childhood, beginning really early.
yeah.
Does Teach for America or Teach for All deal with that age range and the very special problems that that arise?
You know, a number of people probably 15 years ago made a huge and successful push to get Teach for America to start an early education core. So there are now several hundred people each year working with 3- and 4-year-olds in both school-based and community-based centers. And we've seen the same phenomenon, I must say. Those people have gone on to be an incredible leadership force in early ed. The early ed program, Universal Pre-K for All in New York, was led by a bunch of Teach for America alumni, and there are many, many other examples of that. We're starting to see network partners across Teach for All do that, and Singapore, Mexico has started a really significant early ed program with the Lego Foundation's support. The Austrian program just did it. I mean, they're starting to get into that, but everywhere it's kind of a different system, so it's a lift.
Over here. I have a question in thinking about the Teach for All and comparing it to the Teach for America. In the African countries and others, the homogeneous nature, racial makeup of people, I'm curious how that plays out in the United States, where oftentimes the Teach for America teachers are racially different than students there. So have we learned anything about how we can have more localized strategies of increasing the racial representation of teachers here?
You know, Teach for America has for many, many years made a huge effort to ensure that the core is increasingly representative of the kids and communities we're working in. More than half of the incoming Teach for America core members are people of color. 43% have Pell Grants. 34% are the first in their families to get a college degree. So it's more than 60% of them share the background of their students on some dimension, economic or racial. At the same time, each and every one of these core members is crossing some sort of line of difference, and I think what we've learned is that they all need to go through quite a significant we put a lot of energy into helping them understand the histories and cultures and contexts in which they'll be working, to understand their own identities, the dynamics of power and privilege, bias, et cetera. So, I mean, there's just I think that's just so fundamental to this work. I will say that one of the biggest undertakings in the global work is to help people in other countries recognize that there's inequity everywhere. And I mean, I think it's very clear in this country, and it's not always clear in countries where there is racial homogeneity. And so helping all of these organizations go through the learning journey of thinking about, like, who are the most marginalized folks in this country, and how do we ensure that the people in our communities are leading and guiding the work. So it's really a journey that needs to and is going on everywhere. Of course, many of the most elite, most educated Nigerians are doing Teach for Nigeria, but how do we think about how to ensure that the folks in our communities are also doing Teach for Nigeria?
Hi. You started out your talk with that picture of your senior thesis and talking about the role that recruiting plays on campus at elite institutions and providing that structured pathway to whatever is going to happen after college. And one of the things that's so amazing about Teach for America is it provides that structured path for a social purpose. But I'm curious either about your own reflections or about the leaders that you've worked with, because you didn't take that structured path, clearly, and I'm just wondering where the moment was when you had this great idea, seems like a good idea, but you didn't just put it on the shelf as a senior thesis. You actually went and did it. That's a huge risk, and I'm just wondering what advice you would have for prospective social entrepreneurs who are wondering, whether they should take that risk.
Yeah. One thing, I don't know. This was such a, I don't know. There's so much that, even to me, this story kind of seems surreal, I have to say. I just became so obsessed with this idea, and that's what led me to do it. I was just like, this has to happen. I spent 2 months of my senior thesis research process trying to figure out who is starting this. Like, someone must be working to start this, because it's so clear. Like, the mood on campuses, I was really right. I was not alone. People were just dying to do something like this. school systems were starting with thousands of teacher vacancies. There were 1,000 vacancies in New York, 1,000 in LA. I mean, like, the corporate community did a big summit that Fortune magazine hosted saying, we need to support education reform. Like, every single piece, it was just perfect. So I think it's kind of a unique story. The other thing is, every time I would tell people I wanted to start this, they would say, this is a great idea. I mean, I would go to districts, school districts, and they would say, are you kidding? I still remember my first meeting in Los Angeles with the head of human resources, who literally leans back, puts his feet on the desk, takes out the paper I gave him of 100 top colleges where I said we were going to recruit the first 500 people, and laughed and said, I'll tell you what, you get 500 kids from these colleges and I will hire every one of them. Meaning, the educators, everyone, this is a great idea, college students will never do it. So that was their thing. And that was the one thing I had any reason to think that they might be wrong about. Like, I was a college student. I could tell them college students want to do this. So when I meet social entrepreneurs, honestly, what I really think is that there's almost too much. I hate to say that, though, because sometimes things should be launched that are new, but I feel like people need to get into the arena, you know, like get proximate to the actual issues and only create something new if there's a true void. Sometimes it's more impactful to work for the thing already addressing the issues, and I truly feel like I am missing something because I didn't teach. Like, to be in education without the experience of having myself worked with kids and families, like, there's something different that Teach for America alumni have that I don't have. A level of unshakable conviction, a level of credibility, a level of insight. I can listen to them all day long and sort of try to, you know, gain some insight, but it's not the same thing. And so I think we should be telling our rising generation, gain proximity. And, you know, don't think, sorry, I mean, I don't know who's watching this. We have consulting firms. I mean, everyone's marketing themselves as the way to make a difference, make an impact, work for X. Like, we're not going to change the world from skyscrapers, really. We might, but we don't want that. We need to change the world. We need the people in communities who gain proximity to work with communities to identify the solution. So I fear that we're moving back in the wrong direction a bit. Like, it's never been harder to recruit Teach for America Corps members, ever. Not in the last 10 years. It's harder than ever. So we got to think about that.
I'm Sarah Shapiro. I'm actually a 2012 TFA Corps member and a student here at Kellogg. Thank you so much for being here. You referenced, when you were talking about systems change, some of the organizations, including Chicago Public Education Fund, that are doing a really good job bringing stakeholders together and catalyzing impact. And I'm wondering, what is it about those organizations that you think, what are those organizations doing differently that you think is the reason that they're making an impact? Because stakeholders are collaborating all over the place and having meetings, and I'm curious where and why you've seen success in some places and not others.
I feel like I fear that I don't know the answer to that. So I think I'm not going to venture an answer to just that, because as you say, there are, like, Strive, for example, has like many collective impact efforts in different communities, and some are really successful and others aren't. And I mean, that's another great research project. Like, we should really try to understand that. And I'm not sure, but I will use this question to share my biggest thought. I mean, I'm obsessing over this because as much progress as I feel like we are seeing in this country, I do also feel like we're more stuck than we've ever been as it relates to, you know, making it, like, the question of will we make as much progress in these communities in the next 20 years as we made in the last 20, I'm very worried. And the thing I'm really thinking about is, I mean, I always had this individual leadership paradigm. Like, this whole thing was about, let's recruit individuals with leadership potential, ensure they succeed with their kids and learn the right lessons, and then accelerate their individual leadership into school principalship, system leadership, social entrepreneurship. And that's going to all add up and move the needle for kids. And it's gotten us a certain distance, but not what we have now in communities is warring factions. People who are so overwhelmed in their work, really good people, who all want the same thing at a very high level, who have their heads down and are going about, who won't even talk to each other for either lack of time or just disagreement, because we haven't learned to exert collective leadership, like to pull up from the individual pursuits and talk with each other and listen and reflect collectively and develop shared vision, and then think our way around some really tough obstacles that just have us all stumped, like how do we pay teachers more and things like this. So I think in part influenced by what I've learned from some of these incredible people in other countries who are thinking about what kind of leadership do we want to develop. Like, we need to develop skills. This was what my Berkeley commencement speech was about. Like, this next generation needs to build skills and muscles that we have not, I think in many cases, taught them, and that they haven't necessarily learned, around how to build authentic relationships across lines of difference, how to create and hold the space to pull us up. So I'm not sure all the collective impact organizations actually do it with a diverse group. Like, we need our students at the table and the students' parents, and like, it needs to be a very diverse group of people, and we need all the actors, not just the ones who want to listen to each other because they all know that they agree on everything. So like, how do we do that? That's going to be the key, I think, to get to the next level. This is what we're obsessing about across Teach for All. How do we develop that kind of leader so that we can finally move more quickly?